Hello, my name is Jonathan Clements and I am the co-author of the Anime Encyclopedia, here to talk to you about the 1983 animated movie Golgo 13, also known as The Professional, which you're watching right now. If you're not watching it right now, you're watching the wrong DVD and there's been a terrible cock-up and people will be fired. I'm going to talk about Golgo and the manga behind him, because he's the product of a very, very long manga series, but also some of the inspirations and the influences behind it. Most crucial among them, I think, is something that's achieved a new level of interest in recent months. I don't know when you're actually hearing this commentary, but I'm recording it on the 8th of January 2007. Happy New Year. Shortly after the universal acclaim for Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, the Bond remake. And that's of interest because the new Bond has supposedly returned 007 to his roots, as they say, not as a suave super agent, but more as an assassin, a hired gun for Her Majesty. That's important because sometimes, particularly if you're English speaking and particularly if you're British, it's easy to forget how James Bond must look to other countries. The thing is that when Bond is repackaged for a foreign audience, it can often lose a sense of the moral high ground. It's often not clear if, Bond is on screen killing, Turks or Russians or Arabs, whether he is necessarily on the side of the goodies, particularly if the viewer is a Turk or a Russian or an Arab. And I bring this up because Golgo 13 and his creator, Takao Saito, are inextricably linked to the James Bond franchise in Japan. After the release of Dr. No, there was a James Bond manga series in Japanese comic form, and Takao Saito was the man who drew it. He drew a manga based on Live and Let Die, which began running in Boy's Life magazine in 1964, and that was followed by manga versions of Thunderball and On Her Majesty's Secret Service and The Man with the Golden Gun. And, what we have is a stony-faced killer, looking a little bit like Sean Connery, travelling the world to exotic locations like Malibu, which is coming up in a moment, and where you'll see people apparently drive on the left. And we have stylistic flourishes like the burning photograph, which if I have time to talk about later on, I will in greater detail. But what we have here is not the original title sequence from the Japanese release. That was actually a computer-generated logo. You just saw a little fraction there of a skeleton, which was part of the computer-generated original. And it had a crown of thorns. And your guess is as good as mine as to why this was replaced with this simple title card that we see here for the American release. One possible reason, I suspect, is that Golgo's crown of thorns sequence risks offending the religious right in America. Although you're probably watching this film with a Manga Entertainment logo on it, the dubbed version that you're seeing was actually made in America by Streamline Pictures. I suspect that somebody at the dubbing company decided it was easier to simply remove it. There's a crown of thorns there, but not computer-generated. We actually do have a bit of computer-generated stuff turning up. Sorry, this is a surprise to me. I wasn't actually expecting to see that on this particular one. We must be using the Urban Vision version rather than the Streamline version I was used to. Well, there's a surprise. I'm going to have a lot to say about computer-generated material later on, but this is actually not something that I was expecting to see at all, and this will not have been seen before in the United Kingdom. The director of this film is Osamu Dezaki, who has a very distinct stylistic touches in his work. He was one of the first generation of post-war animators actually working as a key animator in 1963 on Astro Boy, and he has a very long track record in TV and movies. He's an absolute master at what we'll call visual economy. He has an artist's eye for zeroing in on the most crucial and symbolic elements of a scene. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Golgo 13, where backgrounds are often surprisingly absent or stylised. There are a lot of close-ups reminiscent of, say, Brian De Palma's camera work in The Untouchables, which was made about 5 years later on, but also freeze frames. So anyway, I am seeing this for the first time, this opening sequence, because I have never actually had the opportunity to see this before. It was used in the Urban Vision release, which was another version of the Streamline dub as it was released in America, but that is quite amazing. I'm sorry, I'm quite stunned, because as you'll find out later on, the nature of the computer graphics work that was used in Golgo 13 is actually one of my main interests in the film, so it's quite fascinating to see it here. This is a first for Japanese animation, and I'll explain how it got there and why it was important later on in this commentary. So anyway, more about Osamu Dezaki. He's an animation director who really believes wholeheartedly in showing up the link between animation and comics. Golgo 13 began as a comic in 1969 when Takao Saito stopped drawing Bond and the Man from U.N.C.L.E. manga. And so Dezaki plays to that with numerous dramatic moments where the action not only freezes, which is itself a money-saving device in Japanese animation, but then the freeze frame degrades and it reverts to something that is much more clearly an illustration. It goes back to its manga roots, and Dezaki keeps this stylistic device in a lot of his work. In fact, he keeps it even when his budget allows him to dispense with it. In fact, if you watch Aim for the Ace, for example, which is another of his works, or Blackjack, you will see the same freeze-frame device repeated over and over again. Anyway, before I get carried away talking about style, and there's a lot of style in this film, not just freeze frames, but these very retro split-screen techniques, but we better return to the plot, because here we have oil billionaire Leonard Dawson just about to announce that his son is his successor. But Robert Dawson, the son, presents him here with a bouquet of flowers, anemones, which are a symbol of fading hope, and white verbena, also known as vervain, which was supposedly the flower used to staunch the wounds of Christ on the cross. And Dawson Jr. makes a point of telling us this because the bouquet is the clue to the rest of the film. It's a cry for help. It literally means, my hope is fading, please help me. But in fact, Golgo is the man who is helping Robert by actually killing him.
Even happier because of the announcement I'd like to make.
Do note, by the way, on this ship, we have behind Robert Dawson's head, we have this very angular design, which is actually a hawk-like design that you'll see on his building at the end. And the centre of the hawk is a kind of diamond shape, a kind of rhombus, which is actually also the shape of the swimming pool on the ship where they're talking. You can see it in front of him here. And also, it forms part of the... it looks not unlike a coffin as well.
And I should add,
you may prefer Disney style, what's known as shooting on ones, when all 24 frames of a film are utilised and the animation is fluid and there are little dancing squirrels in an image that take a year to complete. But Japanese animators often don't have that option. They have to work with the materials they have, and many of their artistic decisions are heavily influenced by budget. What you do get in Golgo 13 for... Well, one of the first times, it's not the first time, because I think Gold Lightan was the first time, but you do get use of lighting effects. You get glints of light, like you see here, which is an attempt to actually replicate mistakes in live-action filming when you get lens flares on a camera, something which Mamoru Oshii used to great effect in Ghost in the Shell, and has become a staple of modern computer-generated animation. But here we have Osamu Dezaki adding these kind of effects to sell animation. Note also the pacing of this film, by the way. It's literally impossible to count up to 120 to get through 2 whole minutes without a fight or a nude scene in this film. And this film really does rattle through the action sequences to tell the story, which I suppose is as good a time as any to talk about the narrative style of Golgo 13. Golgo has been running in Japanese comics magazines for 38 years, and although he was chattier and funnier in his early days, he's become a lot more stony-faced and quiet as he got older, and Takao Saito worked out what his audience wanted. He will take any job, and usually will find himself on the side of the good guys, although good is often a relative term. And one thing that he does insist on is that he is told why he's taking on a job. And that stipulation leads to scenes where people actually have to explain to him the reason that they are taking out the contract and why the person that he's killing is bad. And it's a very, very handy way of getting through large chunks of plot in great detail. And a perfect example is here in the graveyard, where this Bishop Moretti, has to explain to Golgo all of the reasons why the Dr. Zed, or Mr. Zed, the evil mafia boss, has to die.
You should refer to him as
It's very handy if you're a writer trying to get through a story to actually have a stipulation from the contract killer that he must know the reason why he's doing it. Makes things a lot easier for you. Now, please note, by the way, that the mission that Golgo's accepting here has almost nothing to do with the central plot. For the next 15 minutes, he's hunting down the Sicilian gang boss, known as Dr. Z, but that has no bearing at all on the Dawson case, which is actually the main structure of this story. There is a cunning little suggestion of the main plot in the fact that the bishop commits suicide after hiring Golgo 13, and as we eventually find out at the end of this film, the Dawson job was itself a very complicated case of assisted suicide. I should point out as well that another of the strange business laws of Golgo 13 in the original comics is that he will only meet you once. So you get him, you tell him the job, and then he does it, and after that you will never see him again, which allows him to move on without any messy scenes of goodbyes. However, what it also does is it makes it unnecessary for most characters who hire him to actually appear again. So there's quite a strong, quite a large number of people who hire Golgo 13 and then end up getting killed as a result, either by accident or by design.
They tell me that only you can make an impossible.
So to return for a moment to the way that Bond films might look abroad, bear in mind that what we're seeing is a reasonable approximation of how many action films appear in translation. Somebody's got shot and then a woman's clothes have inexplicably fallen off, and they'll be at it again in a moment. One of this movie's greatest fans, unsurprisingly, was Lawrence Guinness, the old manager of Manga Entertainment, and I remember him once in a pub proclaiming that Golgo 13 was a fantastic film for him. He refused to hear a bad word said about it, and that was very surprising at the time, because Lawrence wasn't backwards in coming forwards if he didn't like something. He was quite happy to tell you, behind the scenes or in a pub or at a party that he didn't particularly like a film very much, but he was very much behind Golgo 13. He really enjoyed the style, the very sparse style in which it only showed you kind of symbolic moments rather than going for Disney-style full animation. He liked the stripped-down reverse engineering of it in the way that it made Osamu Dezaki, the director, would actually cut right to the heart of what made a Hollywood action movie work. Not in Hollywood, but in the rest of the world. To my mind, parts of it, I must confess, are still ludicrous, such as this scene here, where a man wanders into the middle of a sex scene and starts briefing Golgo 13 on his next mission. This mustachioed individual is this movie's equivalent of Q, Bond's special items guy, and much as Q does in the 007 movies, he can pop up literally anywhere. Not that his arrival distracts Golgo 13 if he will forgive me, busy on an important job. You will perhaps be amazed to hear that nobody really knows anything about Golgo 13, despite 40 years of operation. He often uses the alias Duke Togo, which may be his real name, or it may not. There have been several occasions in the manga series where it appears that details of his identity are revealed, but they always turn out to be doubtful information. So we really don't know how he's somehow acquired this network of followers and assistants and hangers-on, particularly consider that they often have such a short lifespan. It's as if the Golgo 13 franchise, the manga and the anime and the various movies, which I'll talk about later, is imitating Bond's support network in the British Secret Service, but without an actual organisation to back Golgo up. In fact, there have been some cases where a kind of a business organisation, an international business organisation was created that kind of worked in the same way as the British government do in backing up Golgo, the way the British government do in backing up Bond, and this kind of business organisation does the same thing backing up Golgo. Over the years, Golgo 13 has had some pretty weird missions, only a fraction of which have been translated into English, although I should point out that Golgo was one of the first manga titles to get translated at all, over 20 years ago, which was when all of today's manga boom was just a twinkle in Tokyo Pop's eyes. His most famous missions are those from the 1960s and the 1970s, when he was very cleverly portrayed as a kind of loose cannon in the Cold War. He famously hunted neo-Nazis in South America and then tracked down the war criminal Martin Bormann. He's worked for the CIA, tracking down and killing double agents. And that, of course, brought him into trouble with the Russians, who then chased after him, but then the Russians hired him as well. And he hunted ivory poachers in Africa. working, believe it or not, as a contract killer on behalf of the World Wildlife Fund. Not that the World Wildlife Fund didn't actually support that in real life, but in the story, the World Wildlife Fund hired him to hunt down poachers in Africa. And a lot of the time we find him in the thick of historical events. Not just because he moves with the times, but because often he has little choice. Golgo 13 is an incredible industry in Japan. He's one of the only manga characters to have a magazine dedicated solely to him. And so Takao Saito, or rather his production studio, Saito Productions, must generate an incredible number of stories. And they really do quite literally rip them out of the headlines. There was one Golgo 13 adventure where he had to assassinate a Tibetan who at the time was one of the many crowd members at the sit-in at Tiananmen Square. And I read one last year where he had to hide out from Condoleezza Rice, who had put out a CIA hit squad on his tail or something. I should say she wasn't called Condoleezza Rice in the comic. She was called Miss Tice from Washington, but it was pretty clear who was intended.
No, John.
Possibly for a British audience, the most controversial Golgo 13 adventure was in 1997 in a story called English Rose, when he was tasked with killing a Muslim man, a thinly disguised allegory of Dodi Al-Fayed, who was having an affair with Princess Diana. And the twist in the tale, if you've seen this movie before, you'll know that Golgo always has twists in his tale. The twist in this particular tale was that another assassin was assigned to kill Princess Diana. So Golgo 13 was successful in his killing mission to kill Al-Fayed, but not in his secondary task, which was to get Diana back to England alive. And that's an interesting flaw in Golgo 13's character. James Bond might suffer from a weakness for the opposite sex, and Superman might have his kryptonite, but if Golgo 13 has a character flaw, it is simply that all he can do is kill. He's always successful at his main task, but he often leaves a trail of collateral damage and vendettas and other disasters in his wake. The script for this film is often appears at first to be a tad too clever for its own good. There are moments, such as this one, where Cindy strips off and has sex with Golgo for no apparent reason, which makes it seem quite pulpy and silly. However, it's only a matter of minutes before we discover that if we find her behaviour here somewhat hard to believe, that's because she's actually attempting to mislead him. And I hope you have actually seen this film before watching the commentary, so you'll know that I'm not giving anything away when I say that Cindy is actually Dr. Z or Dr. Z, the mafia mastermind. So you could argue, if you were a Golgo apologist, that the ludicrous nature of this scene is deliberate. It says to Golgo fans, come on, something must be up, there must be something going on here. What's interesting for me as well is that we have dispensed here, as it were, with the pleasantries. They're already naked. We've obviously done at some point, not shown in this film, the bit where he must have said, my name is Togo, Duke Togo, but they haven't shown it. And I wonder about the voice actor playing Golgo 13, who thought this was great to have a headline role, but in fact all of the scenes of human interaction are cut out, because human interaction is not important for Golgo. He is literally portrayed as a machine. Takao Saito has said, I think of him as a killing machine, so we don't actually have him talking to people very much. If you watch this film, this is actually the first scene where Golgo really says anything at all, and we're 18 minutes into the film already. In case you were wondering, the actor who plays Golgo 13 in the English language dub is Gregory Snegoff, who is still a prominent figure in the voice acting world. He's just done the Robotech Shadow Chronicles, and he played the father figure in the original dub of My Neighbor Totoro. If you are looking at the manga entertainment videos on your shelf, and I'm sure you must be, then you'll be looking at Wicked City, in which he played Taki Renzaburo. So he was the leading man in Wicked City as well. And all of this must look great on his CV, because he hardly says a word in this film. There are a couple of scenes when Duke gets chatty, but most of the time he's a silent figure. So it wouldn't surprise me if Snegoff was able to record most of his lines in just an hour or so. However, interestingly, the dubbing director must have realised this, because Snegoff has another part to play in this film, which we'll see later on. So, Cindy's just pretended to have a phone call from her father, although since it's unlikely that you don't know already that she's Dr. Z, especially since I've just told you, she is actually only pretending to receive a phone call from her father in order to throw Golgo off the trail.
You were never worried.
Since the camera is focusing on a girl for one of the rare occasions in this film that it does, I thought it might also be a good time to talk about the designer and lead animator on this movie, which is Akio Sugino. Now, Sugino invariably worked with Osamu Dezaki. They've got a long and fruitful working relationship that stretches back 20 or 30 years, and it's often possible to tell you're watching a Dezaki film just because of the Sugino artwork. And this pair worked their way up through the medium of girls' stories, most notably Aim for the Ace, which is an adaptation of a tennis manga. And you can see that Sugino, for his part, isn't too fussed about the way that men look in the film. He draws them as broad-shouldered and wrinkle-faced brutes. And the women get all these fantastic flicky hairdos like Farrah Fawcett and have a very 70s look about them, which I would suggest is a design decision from Sugino. The women in the Golgo 13 manga, the original comic I'm talking about here, they move with the times, they move with fashions, whereas these are very much Sugino's personal idea of feminine beauty. Interestingly for me, this scene in the elevator is a departure from the Golgo 13 norm. Some of the stories have a fantastical element, that much is true, but in this movie there are several elements which are literally fantastic. And we've yet to see the snake or gold or silver, but we did have that gadget briefing from the watchmaker, which I'd suggest is a symptom of the animated nature of this production. Because when Golgo 13 is a live-action production, and it has been on at least 2 occasions in the past, the emphasis is on the real and the physical. It's on gunplay and punch-ups. Golgo 13 has been played live-action by Ken Takakura, and then the even more fabulous Shinichi Chiba, also known as Sonny Chiba. Now, Takakura really is the quintessential Golgo. In fact, Golgo's creator, Takao Saito, actually confessed that Takakura was his model for Golgo 13 originally. Ken Takakura was the Michael Douglas's partner in Black Rain. That's probably where he's most likely to be remembered from now. And you can actually see the look of Golgo 13 in this film. Even in this animated version, it owes a lot to Bond-era Sean Connery, but also to Ken Takakura. Now, Sonny Chiba, however, who was in the second Golgo film, live-action film, he's a martial artist. And I believe it or not, I actually married into a family of martial artists, and they don't take any crap movie-wise, but they love Sonny Chiba movies because he's not an actor who can fight. He's a fighter who can act. And so in the Sonny Chiba Golgo 13 movie, you get more serious martial arts. But this is the Golgo 13 anime, and if it's animated, it means we can do things that are simply too expensive live action. And there's a reason why so much anime is science fiction or fantasy, because really you're only spending the cost of a pot of paint. And it doesn't matter if you're painting a little bunny rabbit, or a flying ninja, or a flying ninja vampire bunny rabbit. Paint is paint. So anime does tend towards the special. Anime is the place where even incidental characters have insane stunts, like Cindy's naked horse ride and her dive from the cliff top. It's the place where we can zoom in on the path of bullets and have these Dezaki freeze frames. The type of thing, of course, which the Wachowski brothers later spent so much money trying to duplicate in The Matrix. And that is why, I suggest, we have this Q-like figure offering us magical gadgets like this super-duper watch here. And some of Golgo's weirder opponents turning up later on. For gritty realism, there's the movies. For everything else, there's the anime. So anyway, while we're putting an end to the Cindy subplot, a few words about Streamline Pictures. Now, I've said this before on Manga Entertainment commentary tracks. In fact, I think if you listen to the Manga Entertainment releases of Kashan or Vampire Hunter D, you'll get me telling you pretty much the same thing, which is that there were a number of Japanese cartoons in the 1980s that were released in the American market by a man called Carl Macek, whose Streamline Pictures company was really ahead of the game when it came to Japanese animation. He was selling anime to the Americans before anyone knew what anime was. And these days, as far as I know, Carl works for ADV Films on some of their newer productions. But back then, he was the go-to guy on selling anime. And if he bought Golgo 13, he bought it because he thought he could sell it to the mainstream. And that might sound like a weird thing to say. It certainly sounds weird in this modern age when so much of the rhetoric of the anime business is centred around appeasing fandom. You know, that bizarre cluster of 10,000 people who all live on the internet and whose every contradictory whim must be obeyed. But Carl Macek comes from a different era. He came from the time when the way to sell a Japanese cartoon was not to make a song and dance about the fact it was from Japan. No, quite the opposite. Back then, before the release of Akira, the way to sell a Japanese cartoon was to pretend it had nothing at all to do with Japan. And so a film like Golgo 13, which has an international cast and an international setting, would appear, and in fact has proved to be, much easier to sell around the world than something that was specifically about, say, samurai. And one way that you could do that was to alter the names, and you could certainly dub it with English voices. There was no way at that time you would subtitle it. And in fact, I believe this edition of Golgo 13 will be the first time Golgo 13 has been released in the UK with the Japanese audio track and the English audio track on the same DVD. So go us. Now, as part of the research for this commentary, I went to my Anime Age History of Japanese Animation, which is a very rare book, which is very useful. And I looked up the Golgo 13 movie, the original release of this particular cartoon, which you will be excited to hear. I'm just checking in the booth to see if they really are excited. Yes, they're nodding. They are excited. Good. It was premiered in Tokyo on the 28th of May, 1983. And what's quite amazing about that is, frankly, how much crap there was about at the same time. 95% of everything is crap, and anime is no exception. But to be frank, the bar on what constituted quality work was only really raised in 1984, when Hayao Miyazaki's first original movie, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, was released. But what Carl Macek did was he really got the best films available for his streamline releases. He got Golgo 13, he got Vampire Hunter D, he got Lensman, and he concentrated on movies. He didn't go too far in the world of videos. And I say this is interesting because anime ages. The film you are watching right now is at least 24 years old. If this is an old DVD and you're watching this in my future, maybe it's even older than that. And I think it's incredible that it's survived. And one of the reasons is because men like Carl Macek and Lawrence Guinness were behind it. My relationship with Golgo 13 is more fractious than that. The entry for Golgo 13 in the Anime Encyclopedia was all my own work, and it was actually the first entry I ever wrote for the book. So if you want to see my personal opinion of it, you can go and look it up there. But what I will say, in the film's defence, is that nothing else released in the year of Golgo 13's premiere has survived. If you're American, you can maybe pick up an old tape of Harmageddon or Crusher Joe, and if you hunt around the right bargain bins, you can probably find an old VHS copy of Urusei Yatsura Only You. Maybe you might find the last Yamato movie. But let me put it like this. Hands up in the audience right now if you have seen manga Aesop's Fables. If you've seen Dolphin's Christmas. If you've seen Nobita's Undersea Adventure or Noel's Mysterious Journey. That's not Noel Edmonds, that's Noel the Fairy. Those films are dead and gone, and the Japanese can't give them away. But Golgo 13 is still going 24 years later. Now, I'm not a fan, a huge fan of Golgo 13. I can appraise it with a historian's eye, and actually for reasons we'll come to later on, when I lecture on anime and manga around the world, I usually find myself showing a clip from Golgo 13 more often than not. It has a very important place in the history of Japanese cinema, particularly regarding anime. And I think it's fair to say that much of its ongoing appeal, regardless of Lawrence Guinness's claims for its stylistic values, for example, is based on the simple, inevitable fact that it's packed with sex and violence. And anime, particularly in the early 1990s in the UK, was associated with sex and violence. Golgo 13 is a film with a lot of that going on, and I think even today there is a certain shock value in the sight of a cartoon with this kind of subject matter. Golgo 13 has a certain simplicity in its animation which has allowed it to age much more gracefully than a lot of the other cartoons released in that year and around that time in the early 1980s. I mean that, like Lupin III, which was also a child of the 1960s stylistically, it has endured for so long it's actually come back into fashion. The ultraviolets and the split screens and the amoral positioning of its hero give it a remarkably strong relationship with modern entertainment. It's more like, Sleeper Cell or 24, for example, or even Dexter, the benign serial killer. And I suspect that Golgo 13 is going to find yet another lease of life in the early years of the 21st century. Manga entertainment, contrary to popular belief, don't tell me everything. They have their secret projects, and I don't know the details of their contracts, but as part of my research for this commentary, I ran the DVD in the corner of my computer screen while I was working. And what surprised me was how well the action translated to a small screen. And when I say a small screen, I mean a seriously small screen. The new growth area in media at the moment is mobile phone and portable media provision. So it wouldn't surprise me if Golgo enjoys a new renaissance there. It seems ideally suited for mobile phones. Not something that anyone could have predicted in 1983, or probably not in 2003 for that matter, but that's one of the amazing things about it. By the way, if you are planning on playing the Golgo 13 drinking game, which I've just made up, but it's probably something to do with drinking every time somebody gets killed, this is death number 16. And after this, I start to lose count of how many people get killed. You'll have to count the deaths yourself after here. So 1 sip for nudity, 1 sip for an on-screen death, a couple of glugs every time Golgo speaks more than a sentence, and you should be nicely pickled by the end. Anyway, after establishing this watchmaker figure as Bond's cue for the movie, he's already set to be dispatched. Very few characters in Golgo 13 have any enduring role. Golgo 13 in the comics does not have a Miss Moneypenny or an M or a long-time Q or Felix Leiter. His adversaries are taken from the headlines, and they often resemble real historical figures. At the time of the First Gulf War, he went after Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But he wasn't sent to kill Saddam, he was just sent to ruin his plans for a supergun, just in case you were worried that the man who was hanged in Iraq at the beginning of this year was an imposter or a robot, none of which would surprise me in the world of Golgo 13, to be honest. But this sequence here, which we're seeing now, is a feature of the later Golgo 13 stories, particularly towards the end of the 20th century. And what we have is 3 government agencies of the United States, the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon, by which they presumably mean the army. And they are all collaborating to bring Golgo down. And the reason why is not made clear at this point. But what is made clear, however, is that Golgo is not part of this. He may be a subject of discussion, but he's not part of this scene. And the next 3 or 4 minutes are taken up with people talking about Golgo, or making plans against him, or arguing amongst themselves. But he's not there. And I bring this up because this is an interesting feature of the storytelling in Golgo 13. Takao Saito is the owner of Saito Productions, but he's one of those Japanese creators who's been able to franchise out much of the work on the titles. And I mentioned earlier that Golgo 13 has a magazine of his own, but he also appears in other publications. He's currently running in a title called Big Comic, for example. And all of this means there's a lot of storytelling to be done, and that Saito Productions doesn't necessarily require Saito himself to draw it all. So in the Golgo 13 manga, you get a lot of nice, exotic locations, and you get concentration on backgrounds and buildings and cars and helicopters, which are all things that an artist can trust his assistants to produce for him with some degree of competence. You can take this a step further when you realise that if the guest star in an issue, shall we say, is the person that Golgo 13 is going to murder, then you don't need to worry so much about how he looks. One of your assistants can draw that particular episode, and they can give him whatever distinctive look they want to, and you won't have to worry if the other assistants can't match it, because he's going to be dead by the end of the issue. That's the character, by the way, not the assistant. What this has led to over the course of 30 or 40 years is that Golgo 13 has become almost a supporting character in the work that bears his name. Saito Productions have exhausted many of the tropes and the traditions of the spy thriller and the noir detective tradition, and Golgo has worn many disguises and been to many exotic locations. So nowadays, an episode of Golgo 13 can hardly feature him at all. There have been 150-page Golgo 13 stories where he only turns up right at the end. In a panel in the background, for example, or firing the final bullet. There are Golgo 13 stories about the aftermath of one of his hits, where he only appears on the first page. And these can often work like detective stories, where the guest star is an officer trying to work out how Golgo did it, or sometimes why he did it, or who hired him even. And this, to me, is a remarkable twist. The idea that by putting your leading man in the background, you could tap into entire new genres and keep the same title on your story. So Golgo 13 has become very unpredictable as a franchise. Golgo 13 can sometimes appear in an espionage thriller as one of the bad guy's goons. He can appear as a lonely minion in a tale of political corruption and financial fraud. He can even be a symbolic figure. He can be a bogeyman used to scare people, like Kaiser Soze and The Usual Suspects. There are stories where people, believe it or not, there are stories where people pretend to hire Golgo 13, hoping that that will flush out their enemies. And even though Golgo 13 hasn't been approached, he usually makes some kind of appearance in the story, even if only to preserve his reputation. There has been some acknowledgement of the sheer amount of time that has passed since the series began. If Golgo was 30 when the comic started, he'd be an old age pensioner by now, and so there hasn't been that kind of recognition. But a couple of years ago, there was a story about someone whose father had been killed by Golgo and who came looking for him 15 years later, so that introduces the idea of a revenge tragedy as well. Anyway, while I've been talking, we've got through the meeting of the three groups and the introduction of Golgo 13's new level boss, the scary Mr. Snake. And the story is dovetailing quite neatly now. Golgo has a new mission which, as with the Sicilian job, has no direct connection with the Dawson plot from earlier on. However, with 2020 hindsight, we will discover that the CIA and the Pentagon are all on his tail.
You're not telling me you're actually doing okay.
And they're hoping to catch him on the new job, taking down Don Hughes. And that the reason that they are interested is because they are being paid to nab him by Dawson in revenge for the assassination of his son at the beginning of the film. Pay attention, there will be a quiz later. And because we've killed off the watchmaker and Golgo needs another figure to supply him with stuff, we introduce the character of Rita in her tasteful 69 t-shirt. Now, it's very common in anime in this country to simply assume if someone's existence is not explained that they must be a figure from the manga, but I don't believe this to be the case. As with other supporting cast members in this movie, we are not getting much loved cameos from characters from the comic. Instead, we are seeing characters created from whole cloth for the benefit of this film alone. And of course, they won't have all that long to live. Which, to be honest, only adds to the mystery. This Rita is gone in just a matter of minutes, but we do get an incredible amount of backstory hinted at here about her racing past and her past associations with Golgo. And in just a while we get her saying the cheesiest line of the entire movie when she says, "I've waited for so long for you to pull my trigger." So Rita is here to supply him with his car and with yet another gratuitous sex scene, which of course is part of Golgo's appeal. In fact, the idea of wholly necessary nudity and shagging as part of the story was regarded as so integral to the Golgo franchise that it became the subject of some controversy back in 1988 with the release of a video game, Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode, as it was called. This was actually released in America and featured Golgo 13 getting framed for the shooting down of a CIA helicopter in New York that was carrying a biological weapon. So, he had the CIA chasing him because they think he's working for the KGB, and they have the KGB chasing him because they think he has the weapon and the antidote. But in fact, he's been hired by another organisation called Fixer to track down the vaccine and the virus, which is all very well, but the actual culprits are a bunch of neo-Nazis led by a cyborg clone of Adolf Hitler, all of which was carefully cut out of the US release. It makes you wonder, actually, how there was any story left by the end if Adolf Hitler was missing along with the cyborgs. However, what was not cut out, bizarrely, was the smoking of cigars, which Golgo does a lot of. And in fact, in the game, if you picked up a packet of fags, you were able to recharge your health. And another way of recharging your health in the game was to have sex with one of the female characters you ran into. And it was all done relatively tastefully, in silhouette in fact, just like this scene here with Rita. But it was something of a surprise in the mainstream world of the Nintendo games console. There was another Golgo 13 computer game which also featured nudity, and that was called The Riddle of Icarus, which was released in the US as the Marfat Conspiracy. And that was about an attempt by an Arab terrorist called Ahmed Khan to blackmail the spacefaring nations of the world by making all their satellites fall out of the sky. And there were a bunch of incredibly dull Golgo 13 pachinko games, which is like pinball, but where you have no actual control over what happens. And one of the difficulties with telling Golgo 13 stories is finding a way around all of the exposition that's required. And in this occasion, Golgo 13 is too cool to do any exposition of his own. Instead, he leaves it to the people who are chasing him to speculate about what he's going to do. And that is why, coming up in just a moment, we have another long scene going through the various means that Golgo 13 might use, although rather obviously to my mind, discounting the one method that he actually will. And so, once again, we have Golgo 13 appearing in these scenes here as a background character in the film that bears his name. They are talking about what he might do, and he's something that they are afraid of and that they're in awe of and that they're chasing, but he's not them.
Golgo 13's objective in San Francisco identified.
I feel in many ways that Golgo 13 often takes the role of the trickster or ninja character in modern espionage. The missions he undertakes are often literally impossible. They are missions impossible in that sense, and they involve a certain amount of cunning. And the sheer volume of Golgo stories ensures that we run out very swiftly of patience with stories where he simply hides in a window and shoots someone. So there is often an element of cunning or a twist in order to maintain our interest. In the case of this one here, it's the will-he-won't-he tension of trying to work out which building he's going to hide in, and a certain degree of cunning in the treatment of bulletproof glass. Yes, bulletproof glass can stop a bullet, but it won't stop 30 bullets, and that's something that Golgo is counting on. I am, however, at a loss in explaining exactly how Golgo knows when to shoot in this coming assassination attempt. Well, actually, I call it an attempt, he's very successful. If this were the comic, there might conceivably be a spotter character telling him, but I think in this case they've just fudged this one. So while we're waiting for the next big hit to take place, I suppose this is as good a time as any to talk about the influence of Golgo 13 on other parts of the Japanese media world, because he is adored by a certain sector of Japanese society. He is, famously, the man's man of manga. The journal that he appears in is aimed at middle-aged businessmen. I don't know any female Golgo 13 fans, but I'm sure they must be out there somewhere. And like a lot of espionage thrillers all around the world, Golgo 13 finds a way of glamorizing a regular and rather mundane feature in the life of the international businessman or travelling salesman. He goes to different parts of the world and he undertakes these strange missions, but big chunks of his life are spent on planes and trains and in lonely hotel rooms. And I think that part of the appeal of Golgo 13 is also part of the appeal of James Bond, to be honest, and his various other action hero colleagues, is that if you're on a plane or a train or in a lonely hotel room, it offers you a sense of entertainment that you can somehow relate directly to your own world. Golgo 13 also has a certain ironic value. He's a stoic, bushy-browed killer, and as such has often been lampooned. There's a comedy duo called Downtown, and they released a love song called Beloved Golgo, in which they sung about how wonderful he is and how handsome and how they love him. And there was a couple of guys singing that, which was kind of weird. There's a Japanese wrestler, I say Japanese, he's a stoic, tall sort of, guy. He was born in Seattle, called Masahiro Chono. And he models himself on Golgo. He comes into the ring with dark glasses on and a raincoat, and he tries to maintain a stony, expressionless face at all times. But I think the place where Golgo really shines is in comedy parodies. And there are a surprisingly large number of those in Japan. The place where Golgo has been referenced the most is in a very long-running series called This is the Kamiari Park Precinct by Osamu Akimoto. And this itself has been running for 30 years or so, and it's a very everyday slice-of-life drama about community policing. So there's not much of the crime and violence. It's more about problem-solving and heartwarming tales of suburban life. It's more of a manga version of Nick Berry in Heartbeat, if you know that TV show. But the strange thing about Kamiari Park is that it has just dozens of references to Golgo 13 over the years. It's all done very affectionately. In fact, a lot of the humour is based on the juxtaposition of the image of hard-boiled killers from action movies with the very mundane and silly everyday concerns of Kamiari Park Precinct. So, for example, in Kamiari Park there's a character called Juzo Golgo, and there are numerous jokes at his expense that play on the punning similarity between his surname, Golgo, and the name Golgo 13. There's a regular guest star whose name is Bolbo, also designed as a joke on Golgo 13. There's a local tough guy who is ridiculed for being, and I quote, bad in the head like Golgo 13. And there's a character who's obsessed with model making, and he comes up with a dinosaur model wielding a modified M16 machine gun, and he calls it, wait for it, Golgosaurus. And he goes on to make a golfing figure, which he calls Golfu 13, and another one called Golgo 31.
We found Golgo 13. He's
Another manga author who can't resist lampooning Golgo 13 is a guy called Hisashi Eguchi. Now, he wrote a story called Onward Pirates, in which there was a character called Sango 15. So not Golgo 13, Sango 15. Yes, it's a bit of a stretch, but I knew what he was planning. He's clearly modelled on Golgo. The same author also came up with what is perhaps the funniest idea for Golgo 13, which was a comic strip called Duke's Days. And it was about a character who was clearly Golgo 13, but who was attempting to make a career change and run a tea shop. So if you can imagine walking in and asking for a cup of coffee and some cheesecake, and the man who's wearing the pinafore and serving you is actually a contract killer trying to go straight, then you get the idea. There are other appearances. Golgo 13 has a strange following in the gay world. There's a KGB assassin who turns up in a chapter of From Eroica with Love, which is about spies, male spies who fall in love with each other. He also has the fate of Golgo 13. There's a pair of guys in Miami Guns called the Golgo Brothers. And there's an episode of, there's a historical story called Oirioma, which is set in the 19th century. It's during the Japanese Civil War, and it features a man who looks suspiciously like Golgo 13 wearing Japanese-style clothes and is presumably intended to be his ancestor. I almost forgot, Ultraman. In the Ultraman anime, there is an alien called Ultra Killer Golgo. But I'm boring myself, so Lord knows how you feel. Anyway, we're coming up to the moment which I mentioned earlier, where Golgo finally gets to shoot Don Hughes through the building, an achievement of superhuman marksmanship, or, if you prefer, blind bloody luck. Although, I must say there are often quite contradictory attitudes towards weaponry in the world of Japanese fiction. There is one school of thought to which Takao Saito is clearly an adherent that says things ought to look realistic. So when we have the M16 rifle that's just been used here, it looks like an M16 might look, but it certainly doesn't behave like one. How many snipers do you know who would legitimately want to use an M16 for long-distance killing work? And you can do it right now. Pause the DVD, ring up one of your sniper friends, and ask him or her what she might prefer to use, and you're not going to hear M16. You'll hear SVD Dragunov, you mark my words. And this attitude used to puzzle me. I wondered why artists and creators like Takao Saito would go to such lengths to reproduce the look of their machinery, but would not adhere to its real-world performance. And there's a geeky part of my soul that wants to see the weaponry used in a more realistic fashion. And the answer, rather surprisingly, presented itself in a Japanese novel I read some time ago by an author called Motoko Arai. And she said, in a little introduction, she said, "Listen, I've included a bunch of things in this book which present themselves as factual information about guns and lockpicking and explosives. And guess what? It's not true. The stuff I'm telling you is designed as entertainment and not as a manual for serial killers and thieves. So yeah, sorry about this, but if I give you incorrect statistics for a gun or a knife or some bit of deadly kit, I'm not doing it because I'm thick or sloppy. I'm doing it because I don't want to encourage you to try this at home." And that may sound to you like a strange cop-out, but it happens surprisingly often, particularly in movies. In Fight Club, for example, when Brad Pitt starts giving you the recipe for making your own explosives, he doesn't actually give it to you. He gives you a series of made-up ingredients, including orange juice, because the creator of Fight Club doesn't want you trying it at home. And I suspect that a similar concern has inspired Takao Saito in his use of certain technologies in Golgo 13. In that regard, I suppose he's the polar opposite of creators like Kenichi Sonoda, who insists in his works on guns that perform in the way that guns do in the real world. In fact, there are entire chapters of Gunsmith Cats, for example, which is by Kenichi Sonoda, that hinge on issues of gun performance and manufacture. So it gets to be like watching an episode of CSI in which people debate the nature of bullet weights or semi-jacketed hollow points or 240 grain weights or certain calibers. And you don't actually get a whole lot of that in Golgo 13, really. The gun is just a tool that he uses to get on with stuff. They don't concentrate so kind of anally on the kind of bullets that he might use. But anyway, this scene we're seeing of the car chase here should demonstrate something I said earlier on about Golgo 13 as a modern ninja, because a lot of ninja lore centres around their ability to escape from seemingly inescapable situations. And I think in this film, we see Golgo 13 somehow escape 2 or 3 times from the exploding wreckage of a burning car. And it's never explained to us how he did it, because Takao Saito often seems more interested and concerned with the myth of Golgo 13, and the idea of him as a legendary killer who is quite literally unstoppable and endowed with superhuman powers. And of course, as the series has progressed, Golgo 13 has become more and more about other people's perception of him, about their fears and their hopes and their worries. He's stopped being a one-man A-team or a one-man equalizer and started to become a supernatural figure. I won't say Ghostface Killer, I'm tempted to. It was a joke that the guy in the comic I mentioned earlier on came up with a dinosaur called Golgosaurus, but sometimes Golgo does seem to have the resilience of Godzilla when it comes to facing large groups of Japanese soldiers with rocket launchers and guns, as seen here when his car has burst into flames and exploded, but somehow he makes it out. With a single bound, Golgo was 3. Now, it's at this point where he comes out of the flames and starts shooting at the soldiers that I lose count of the number of deaths in this film. So if you're playing the Golgo 13 drinking game, I'm afraid your alcohol intake is now your own problem. That is, if you're still conscious by this point. But it's also worth noting that while Golgo 13 might be superhuman on occasion, he's certainly not indestructible. He can be hurt. He's not invincible like Captain Scarlet or Captain Jack. He can and is often wounded. And some of the transition scenes in this movie make it clear that a lot of time has passed. He's not Jack Bauer in 24, who, with one scene following on directly from another. The events we see in this film occupy a large swathe of time. At least weeks, possibly months, perhaps even years. We've seen him badly injured, and we've seen him zip around the world from country to country. He's using up a lot of time, and we are only seeing the high points. This is the scene where his nemesis of the week, Bragan, I know it sometimes sounds like Reagan in a dub, but it's actually Bragan, is killed off. Poor little sidekick. Played in the Japanese version, incidentally, by the guy who played Watson in Sherlock Hound, and played in the American dub by Mike Reynolds, aka Ray Michaels, better known today for his roles in Appleseed, Ghost in the Shell, A Standalone Complex, and as Nezu, the rat-faced politician in Akira. So anyway, Golgo's made it out, but he is wounded, and so there's going to be some kind of recuperation time, which is presumably going to take several days. That's another example of just how much time can actually be encompassed by this film. It's not events just happening in one day, and frankly, there's no guarantee that it hasn't been 2 or 3 years since the death of Dawson at the beginning. I think it's important to realise that Golgo 13 is not necessarily, having a hit and having to kill somebody every single day. Anyway, we're coming up to the point where Rita is offed by the snake, which is as good a time as any to talk about the snake. He's not actually credited in the Japanese version. Or rather, I've looked him up on the JMDB, the Japanese movie database, and he's not there. And he's not in the Animage guides either, so I don't know who plays Snake in the Japanese release. However, I can tell you who plays him in the American version, and it's something of a surprise, because in the American release of Golgo 13, Snake is played by Gregory Snegoff, who also plays Golgo 13. So obviously they got him in the studio for the day, recorded his lines for about 10 minutes, because Golgo doesn't have a whole lot to say, and then realised that since they'd paid for him, they might as well get him to do something else. And somewhat ironically, they ask him to play a character that he has to fight. So when Snake and Golgo square off against each other later on in the film, you'll actually be listening to the sound of Gregory Snegoff fighting against himself, which, funnily enough, happens surprisingly often in the anime world. If your dub budget is high enough, you'll be sure to make sure that all the principal characters are playing their own roles and not doubling up. But particularly down the scale with the henchmen and the bit parts, it can be quite common that you will have an actor who records man A punching someone and then has to go back into the studio and record the sound of man B getting punched, and he ends up fighting himself. And I think the winner in the audio world has to be Toby Longworth, who provided the voice of Judge Dredd in the Big Finish audios. I wrote one called Trapped on Titan, in which he had to fight himself twice, I think, because he was playing so many of the parts. So, this is the point where it's revealed that the three agencies are actually working for Dawson. If you're a fan of the Count of Monte Cristo, you may notice that this story is a variant of it, in the sense that the Count attempts to exact revenge, but in the process ends up hurting those people who are supposed to be his allies. And let's do what Takao Saito does on so many occasions and take Golgo 13 out of the equation. And what we're left with is the story of Dawson's revenge. He tears his family apart, seeking to avenge himself on the killer of his son. And in fact, all he does is destroy the sanity of his daughter-in-law, ruin the childhood of his granddaughter, and cause the death of his faithful manservant. So, ultimately, he brings about his own downfall, and Golgo walks away because even though he's fired the fatal bullet at the beginning, he was only following orders. So, here it's probably worth mentioning again something that I brought up earlier on. Right at the beginning of the film, we saw the Dawson yacht, which was so huge as to be more of an ocean liner or an aircraft carrier with a huge lozenge-shaped swimming pool. And that lozenge or shield, some might even say coffin-shaped design, is a motive that you see throughout the movie in any property owned by the Dawson family. And this scene in the Dawson house, particularly when Snake goes after Laura, includes moments when you see panelling or designs on doors that recall the original coffin-shaped design.
What do you mean by
And it also occurs in the Dawson building that we get toward the end of the final battle, and the form from which Dawson will ultimately jump to his death. Since, while recording this commentary, I've now seen the original opening segment, you also see the kind of hawk design. It's like it's the breast of the hawk as well, or the eagle that's on the side of the building, and that turns up in the computer animated sequence as well, which is nice. A little word about Laura Dawson, by the way. In the Japanese language version of Golgo 13, she was played by an actress called Reiko Muto, who was actually a lot older than the character she plays. She was about 48 when she recorded this role, and it was actually one of her last parts. She's probably best known in Japan, certainly, as the voice of Marvelous Melmo, who was one of the original magical girls. She was a superhero heroine who could transform into an older version of herself to, fight crime. She played Maya in My Youth in Arcadia, and she was Kay's mother in Project A-ko. But after this appearance in Golgo 13, her work thinned out somewhat, at least in the anime world. But in live-action dubbing, she actually has an even higher profile. She was the voice of Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, and she was the voice of Grace Kelly in the Japanese dub of Rear Window, the Alfred Hitchcock film, and she was Janet Leigh in the Japanese dub version of Psycho. So I think you can see that Muto has quite a classy, her voice has quite classy associations for the Japanese audience, deliberately chosen, I suspect, to evoke a sense of violated gentility in scenes such as this. I say was because sadly Reiko Muto died quite recently. She died in October 2006. Now compare that casting decision with Toshiko Fujita, and she played Cindy, the mafia girl, back in Sicily. Fujita was in her 30s when she recorded that role, and she has an absolutely massive CV behind her. In Japanese telly, she was the voice of Murphy Brown in the TV series with the same name. But she's also Tracy Clark in Ally McBeal, but also Ellis in Family Ties and Carol in Blossom. So a big TV resume behind her there, a familiar and experienced voice, and still recording today in anime shows such as One Piece. But anyway, sorry, I was supposed to be talking about Laura Dawson, who in the English dub was played by an actress called Edie Merman, also sometimes credited as Penny Sweet. And I remember her as Clarissa McDougal in the streamlined dub of Lensman, but she's done a lot of other anime, including Vampire Hunter D. Many cast members on this film are in both, and in more recent times she's done voices in Howl's Moving Castle and Digimon and The Big O, so still working, I'm happy to say. Anyway, there is absolutely no point for Golgo 13 to go to the Amazon rainforest. In cutting to Brazil, just for this talky scene with his latest contact, we get that sense of time passing, and also a rather showy way of reminding the audience that paint is paint, and if you want to move the action to a different continent just for a minute, then we can.
No, it's just the name of some guy I put away.
I feel I should point out that location shooting in anime is not merely a case of saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was a scene in Antarctica? Quite often, not in this case, but quite often nonetheless, it's merely a means of justifying a location hunt, in Japanese a rokehan, in which members of the crew will get to head off and take photographs of stuff. Now sometimes this can be absolutely crucial. There's some fantastic location work in Spriggan, for example, which involved hundreds of photographs taken of Istanbul. And also when Katsuhiro Otomo made Steam Boy, he sent 2 photographers over to London and Manchester to get photographs of period buildings. Now I personally spent a long time dragging a guy called Gichi Otsuka around London in Soho and Covent Garden and Old Compton Street just so he could get photographs of Victorian buildings. So anyway, in less honourable anime productions, you may find that some foreign location shoots are simply excuses for prolonged works outings. The most scandalous one for me was the Gunsmith Cat one, where half the production team went to Chicago so they could try out a bunch of guns and fast cars. So, nice work if you can get it. Anyway, while I've been wittering, we've actually got to the crucial scene where Dawson reveals that he genuinely is the man behind the mission. And on the subject of Dawson, by the way, he was played in the Japanese dub by a man called Goro Naya. And I imagine he's best known for playing Inspector Zenigata, who's the unstoppable detective who pursues Lupin III around the world in all of the Lupin films. And the Lupin TV series and never quite catches him. But if you're Japanese, when you hear the voice of Goro Naya, when you hear the voice of Raymond Dawson, this character in Golgo 13, what you actually hear is the Japanese dubbing voice of Charlton Heston. Because whenever Charlton Heston does a film, you know, Ben-Hur, Soylent Green, El Cid, Planet of the Apes, the same guy does his voice in Japanese, and that guy is Goro Naya. So if you really wanted to replicate the effect of this movie on a Japanese audience, you would need to be hearing Charlton Heston in those scenes. If you're listening to this in English, though, the voice of Leonard Dawson is actually provided by Michael McConaughey, known today for appearances in Eureka 7 and Samurai Champloo. But back in the 1980s, he was one of the Streamline regulars. And he also appears as the voice of the eponymous Vampire Hunter D, as Van Buskirk in Lensman, and he was also in Cagliostro Castle Cagliostro, the original dub of the Lupin III film. This sequence here, when they talk about the strange test of assassins, just as a bizarre aside, the Taiwanese Special Forces have a very similar exam. Anyway, Dawson's got this curious tale about the secret experiment where assassins are sent into the jungle. And if you happen to be a member of the Taiwanese Special Forces, I'm told that your final exam is quite horrific. It's not quite as bad as this, but you are dumped literally naked in the Taipei sewer system. And you must then live underground for 3 days. And God knows how you find food or water or shelter, or how you manage to avoid getting all manners of diseases or infections, but that's how it works. So, these 2 guys are the next level bosses, as it were. Gold and Silver. Rather fanciful creations. And I'm afraid they haven't endured quite as well with the Japanese audience as other characters might have done, like the Snake. And the reason is that nobody could have foreseen before this film went into production that the terms gold and silver now don't simply refer to metals. They're not simple nouns. Many years after Golgo 13 was made, featuring the scary assassins Gold and Silver, 2 old ladies became national celebrities in Japan. They were twins, and they were very old, and they actually made it to 100 years old. And they weren't the oldest women in Japan, but because they were twins, they kind of gained a celebrity status. And their names were Kin and Gin, Kin-san and Gin-san, which means, I'm afraid, Miss Gold and Miss Silver. And Kin and Gin were really big deals in the 1990s. They got their own book and their own TV program, and they got to be pundits about pretty much anything. The media would send reporters to ask them what they thought of contemporary news issues, And you could pretty much guarantee they would say something mental and it would get on the news. The Japanese loved them. They inspired a couple of turn-of-the-century TV shows about women born at the end of the 19th century who saw the whole of the 20th century unfold. And they died in 2000. But what all this means is that to a modern Japanese audience, gold and silver are not a couple of sinister, intimidating hitmen, but a kind of historical in-joke that recalls little old ladies. And that, I'm afraid, does kind of ruin some of the scary value of them, really. Just a note here, while I have the time, by the way. I mentioned earlier on that Saito Productions is a team effort, that the artists who work for Takao Saito divide up the work of drawing Golgo 13 between them. And there are a number of famous artists who started out working for Saito Pro, and a surprising number of writers as well, who were once members of Saito Pro. So, for example, there are people like Kazuo Koike, who's better known for Lone Wolf and Cub, who used to write anonymous chapters of the Golgo 13 manga. Also Yuji Horii, who wrote Dragon Quest and Chrono Trigger. He used to write Golgo 13 for Saito Productions. So a surprisingly large number of modern talents cut their teeth on this old favourite when you think about it. And that actually helps to explain why there are so many references to Golgo 13 in other manga, because there are so many people in the manga world who actually, Golgo 13 was one of their earlier jobs. So here we're cutting to a jail scene where Golgo's enemies are going to retrieve gold and silver from captivity. And I find this to be quite fascinating because it's almost, the dialogue in this scene is almost an exact duplicate of a piece of dialogue from the works of Thomas Harris. And normally I would assume it was a rip-off, but it can't be, because this actually precedes that work. It has to be a coincidence. There is a scene in The Silence of the Lambs where Clarice Starling is led to Hannibal Lecter for the first time, and she hears this speech about what he might do to her, and she's given a series of warnings about him. And that speech, which is very close to the one that we see here, was not actually from the book of Silence of the Lambs. It actually appeared in the first book, Red Dragon, when it was kind of lifted and put into the Silence of the Lambs movie. And that book, Red Dragon, was not translated into Japanese until after Golgo 13 was released. So anyway, I think this highly necessary shower scene here is the last nudity in the film. More multitasking here from Gregory Snegoff, who is not only Snake and Golgo as an actor, but he's also credited as the director of the English dub, and with being the rewriter of the English language script. And, on the front of his car as he's driving here, I just realised the coffin-shaped motif is actually where the little spirit of whatever it's called would be on the front of a Rolls Royce. I never noticed that before. There you go. I've seen this film so many times, I've never saw the front of his car before. Anyway, sorry, Emily is shooting the gun, so I should talk about Emily before she disappears from the film. A sign that the Golgo 13 dub was something of a family business. Emily's played by a child actress called Carlin Mickelson, and she doesn't have a whole lot of credits, but I presume that she's the younger sister of a voice actress called Lisa Mickelson, who at the time was the wife of Greg Snegoff. Lisa Mickelson was also in a number of Streamline dubs at the time, but she was killed in a car accident in 1991. Meanwhile, Snegoff himself got his own big break in anime when he appeared in Robotech, which was a job he got, at least in part, because his mother, Alexandra Kenworthy, was also in it. On the subject of family matters, we now see Dawson and Laura arguing over the custody of Emily, and once more, Golgo 13 is out of the picture. Very much in the spirit of later Golgo manga, as I pointed out earlier, this could be a TV movie of the week, and Golgo could simply turn up playing the heavy in a couple of scenes, but his part in this drama is important and pivotal, but doesn't require his full-time presence. We're coming to the big finish now, and so I suppose I should clear up a few facts and bits and bobs that we haven't gone over yet. I'm just trying to think if there are any notables in the cast and crew of Golgo 13 that I haven't actually talked about yet. And I suppose that the only one of any great significance is Toshiyuki Omori.
There must have been someone who asked.
Most of the stuff I've heard from Omori, or rather that I took notice of from Omori over the years, has been orchestral. But in Golgo 13 he writes a score that uses many more modern instruments, there's a bluesy influence and a jazz influence much more in the spirit of some of John Barry's works, which of course is another connection to James Bond. But you may recognise the name Toshiyuki Omori from more recent anime such as Chromati High and Pre-Tier in recent years. And back in the past he was also responsible for Devil Hunter Yoko, which was actually one of the first anime I translated. Before I forget, there are actually 2 Golgo 13 anime in existence. There's this one, which is the one that everybody knows. I've just seen in the window, there's the coffin shape again. There we go. Sorry, there's this one which everybody knows, and there is a much more minor later release which went straight to video, and that was called Golgo 13 Queen Bee. And Queen Bee is another America-based Golgo 13 story, so I think you can see where the producers thought their primary sales base was going to be. And although Queen Bee was very much a 90s production, owing more to Miami Vice and Scarface, as opposed to the kind of Cold War influences of this movie. So, unsurprisingly, Queen Bee was the leader of a drugs cartel who was hoping to kill off an American presidential candidate, and Golgo 13 was set on her tail to try and stop her. And inevitably, as you can probably guess from the way things went between him and Cindy in this movie, he ended up getting her to take her clothes off, and, well, you know, that's Golgo 13, that's what he does. Just a little note here on the matter of the suspension of disbelief again. It does strike me as rather strange that Golgo 13 could get away with carrying a gun onto and off of a plane, and then get involved in a shootout at an American airport. Those of you who've attempted to get through an American airport wearing your own clothes and with your own shoes, it does seem faintly strange. However, I should point out, firstly, the suspension of disbelief angle, that the creators of Golgo 13 are rarely interested in the deliberate and careful recreation of actual violence. But there's also something of particularly common occurrence in the anime business, and that is this bizarre obsession with foreign places, particularly America. And what I mean by this is that if you only ever saw American cop shows or American action movies, you might be forgiven for thinking that America is an incredibly violent place and everyone carries a gun and there's a shootout every 5 minutes. And American television does itself no favours with programmes like Cops and Police Stop, which are put onto a mainstream television in Japan. An everyday American TV programme is simply not seen on Japanese television. It all goes on cable. But you can guarantee that if you want to see muggers and men robbing 7-Elevens and shootouts with the police for real, you only have to watch Japanese television during prime time, because that's where it all gets shoved. And this kind of attitude, this awe of American violence, or this fear of it, or this suspicion that that's all there is to America, is particularly prevalent in anime. America is this kind of fantasy otherworld for the Japanese, in the same way that for so many Americans, so many British, Japan is a fantasy otherworld. Most notably, there's a show called Mad Bull 34, which is shockingly inaccurate in its depiction of life in the American police force. It's dripping with drugs, and all the women are hookers, and all the men are rapists, and everyone's always shooting at each other and always carrying a gun. I am not defending the depiction of foreign countries in Japanese animation or culture, nor am I attacking the Japanese obsession with violence as being something that only happens to other people. That's part of the nature of this kind of entertainment, is that our heroes suffer for us so that we don't have to go out there and do it ourselves. But just as it is possible to assume that all Oriental featured people are ninja or yakuza because that's all you see them doing on screen, it's important to remember that media images can influence other people's perception of one's own country. And just as I began this commentary talking about misunderstandings of James Bond, leading to a certain extent to misunderstandings of Golgo 13, it brings me, after many ramblings, to the most controversial thing about Golgo 13. Lawrence Guinness brought it up many years ago, and presumably he heard it from one of the producers, which is why he said it to me. And the weird thing is that according to him, the Golgo 13 movie was part of an extended effort by the Japanese to appeal to the West. Anime in Japan after the late 1960s was primarily aimed at the domestic market. if a foreign company came and waved money at the Japanese, as they often did, the Japanese would happily make stuff to order. But generally, in most cartoons made during this period, the only intention of the filmmakers was to make something to sell in Japan. And if somebody turned up later on and bought it for a foreign market, that was nice, but it was not expected. So, for example, in 1995, I interviewed a producer from Pioneer who said 5 to 10% of our income is derived from foreign sales. These days, it's much higher. In fact, there are some production companies that don't even involve themselves at all in making a new anime unless they know they've got foreign money coming in. So everything has changed. It can be... I won't name the company because I'll get into trouble, but there's one company, a very famous Japanese animation studio, that refuses now to embark on a new production unless a foreign company, particularly an American company, said, okay, here's 30% of the money that you're going to need. Now, back in the 1980s, such a gravy train for the Japanese was a mere twinkle in producers' eyes. And as Lawrence Guinness tells it, one means of getting foreign attention in the eyes of producers was to make a film that, and I quote, foreigners will like. So much of the action and the sex and the violence in Golgo 13 and the choice of location and the choice of race in the protagonists and the antagonists was all deliberate. It was aimed at selling Golgo 13 to foreigners, to me and you. And if there's something you don't like about the film, quite possibly it was put there in the mistaken belief that you would. And we're now approaching a moment which has ensured Golgo 13's place in the history of anime. Forget style, forget controversy. There is something about this film which has ensured that people like me, who talk about anime for a living, are always talking about this film. And you may remember earlier on that I mentioned the opening credits. There are some DVD releases in which the original opening credits have been restored, and much to my surprise, while recording this commentary, I found out this DVD is one of them. But what makes them interesting is the fact that they featured rudimentary computer graphics. Now, these days, computer graphics are an everyday part of the film business. Computer enhancement is used all over the place. It adds ceilings and outside views to studio scenes. It removes facial blemishes from well-paid actresses. In fact, there is one well-known actress whose skin is apparently so bad that her fee includes $1 million set aside for taking out her spots. Now, that's very unfair for me to target this one person, because we all have spots and we all look bad on our off days, and trust me, I look pretty bad right now. But this is the kind of thing that computer graphics are used for. But let me take you back in time to the beginning of the 1980s, when this was all new. Computer graphics were not about hiding problems, they were about spectacle. And when I talk about spectacle, I suppose what I really mean is showing off. And that's something that was done very well in 1982 in a film called Tron, of Steven Lisberger. And for those of you who don't know it, it was a Disney movie. It was like a cybernetic version of Fantastic Voyage, in which a man is shrunk down to the size of a pixel and sent on an adventure through the insides of a computer. And a lot of what people remember today about Tron is the strange recolouring of the images and the film's very distinct look, but it also contained conspicuous computer graphics. And the thing about Tron's director, Steven Lisberger, is he hasn't made that many movies in his time before Tron, but in 1979 he did make one that was called Animal Olympics, and it was a cartoon. And so because he made a cartoon, he was more likely to show up on the radar of people working in Japan, like Osamu Dezaki, who at the time was working on Golgo 13. And it's pretty clear to me that someone, possibly Dezaki himself, possibly a producer hoping to come up with some kind of gimmick in this film, decided they would throw some computer graphics into his own movie. And there are severe limitations on what you can show with CG at this time. Realistic human movement is still a decade away. Realistic human faces are still 20 years away. So all we can really trust 1980s computer graphics to do is to handle big, unwieldy, solid objects. So Dezaki found a scene which would work, and he got his animators on the case with the helicopters and buildings. And you notice earlier on there was a shot of the pilot of the helicopter, but his face was obscured by a helmet. So when Golgo 13 was released in 1983, it featured that scene that you've just seen, this brief CG moment of helicopter gunships. And there was this kind of sudden wrench. It went from a traditional animation style to something that was clearly computer animated. For its day, it was incredibly well animated, but nevertheless, it's what we would call old-fashioned computer graphics. And that was the first computer-generated sequence in Japanese animation. In fact, the first sequence was arguably the opening credits that we talked about earlier on. But whichever part of the film you decide to concentrate on, Golgo 13 is currently acknowledged as the first example of computer graphics in anime. And what that means is that every time we talk about CG, the cornerstone of modern anime, we talk about Golgo 13. Now that jolt between cell and computer graphics is a perennial problem in early digital animation, and some people were already suggesting that computers, as they fell in price and increased in numbers, could be put to better use in the animation industry. But we're talking about the early 1980s. At the time this film was made, the most affordable personal computer was a ZX Spectrum. And they weren't really suitable for use on films. And people weren't even using word processors in Japan at this point, and many of the scripts remained handwritten for another 10 years. So the kind of computers in use in the movie business were much bigger and more powerful and exclusive. And I'm talking to you about things like the Cray. And these days, if you wanted to use computer hardware in your movie, you can buy a big chunk of it in the high street. But back then, we were talking about renting space on some huge device like a radio telescope or a satellite. And this is what Osamu Dezaki did for this film. The computer graphics in this sequence are credited in part to the computer graphics unit at Osaka University. So anyway, while I've been talking about this, we've reached the infamous point where Golgo and Snake fight each other. In other words, where voice actor Gregory Snegoff has to fight with himself. And with that, Snake is dispatched by an unexpected expedient, which is being shot at by a helicopter through the lift, and the way is clear for the final battle. With the departure of Snake, Golgo only has one more obstacle to deal with, which is gold and silver. And they are the last physical encounter he has in this story. Now, the unwritten rules of action movies dictate that we can't just shoot them. The final battle, regardless of the weapons used in the previous fights, the final battle has to be fought hand to hand. But Osamu Dezaki isn't just going to give us men hitting each other. He, or possibly Akio Sugino, has made a very interesting stylistic decision in this final sequence, which is that much of the final action is in front of a series of Venetian blinds. So you get this stark alternations of very black and then very white brightness. And this zebra-like, almost strobing effect in the background is a steal from a very famous Japanese director, Akira Kurosawa, who used it himself to great effect in a film called Stray Dog. I don't mean these lines here, I mean the slats in the blinds that you'll see in a moment. So, one of the unspoken rules of action movies is that things can't simply be ended in the grand finale by shooting someone. When Indiana Jones pulls out a gun and shoots the swordsman in the marketplace, that's okay for the middle of the film, but not for the end. David and Goliath, that's not going to happen in Hollywood. The movie audience, supposedly, this is the rules of producers I'm quoting here, not the rules of the world, demands mano a mano action. It demands physical violence. But is this the climactic battle? We haven't established who the bad guy is, although thanks to Golgo's various killings over the last hour, the size of the list of suspects has shrunk to a number so manageable as to be almost of Scooby-Doo proportions. But let's not worry about that now. Let's not worry about the fact that it might be obvious that the only person left alive is is Dawson, and that he's somehow responsible. Let us also not worry about the fact that the rules dictate Golgo cannot really get into a fight with Dawson. He needs to, narratively, have this penultimate showdown with gold and silver, because when he gets to Dawson, when he gets to the real baddie, Dawson's just a fat old man. There is no victory or moral high ground there in wading in and killing him. So we need to have these minions, these henchmen, these level bosses, if you will, to place Golgo in a degree of jeopardy. Now, possibly, You may think I'm making all this up, but if so, I draw your attention to what happens when these unwritten rules are not followed. Take Spriggan, for example, an anime movie from the 1990s in which the big bad guy at the end is a weak, feeble child with psychic powers. And although he was invested with a degree of nastiness and psionic abilities, when push came to shove, what we ended up seeing was a hero throwing a small child around a room. And to be frank, it didn't seem all that heroic, really. And since you've already seen this movie, you'll know that Dawson will actually make Golgo's life really easy for him and actually throw himself out of the window. But in the meantime, we get this final, very physical battle between Golgo and Gold and Silver. You see, I'm sorry, when I say those names, and I immediately think now of these little old Japanese ladies, which is probably why I shouldn't be allowed near a microphone. Anyway, just as an aside, an element of the escalation of the action here can be seen in the fact that Golgo is fighting two opponents. They are ganging up on him, and this should, in a sense, improve his standing with the audience. We're supposed to see him as an underdog, because these bullies are ganging up on him and he's outnumbered. Although, of course, that doesn't always work either, because if you've seen The Phantom Menace, you'll know that George Lucas will happily write a scene in which two Jedi will gang up on poor old Darth Maul. And I felt quite sorry for Darth Maul. I thought that, what kind of Jedi Masters are these, if it's going to take two of them to take him down? So, with the death of Silver coming up, it's time for the final confrontation between Golgo and Dawson. And strictly speaking, all Golgo is going to have to do is stand there, because Dawson has brought all of this on himself. Incidentally, in the original script in Japanese, his name is clearly listed as Ronald Dawson. And I don't know if it was changed to Leonard Dawson by choice or by accident, or considering the name of the ship that belongs to him, it's called the Leonard Dawson ship. It's definitely Leonard now and not Ronald. So anyway, eating a hand grenade, not a particularly nice way to go, although remarkably his head still appears to be in one piece, which I have never really quite worked out. This scene here with Leonard Dawson all on his own, the millionaire with his giant building but no one to put in it, and the flowers on the desk. The flowers, remember, which, as I pointed out in the beginning, have a secret message contained within them. Manga authors, particularly in the market of manga for businessmen, really do excel at adding that kind of trivia to their works, particularly in the worlds of gourmet cooking, wine, and bizarrely flowers. Now, it may sound weird because, Golgo 13 runs in a comic anthology aimed at middle-aged businessmen. You think they'd be more interested in, cars and briefcases and whatever it is middle-aged businessmen are interested in. But many of the other titles in that sector follow very, very similar lines. They're not just there for entertainment. Believe it or not, it also has an educational value. You never know. If you are a 40-year-old businessman, if you were standing in a flower shop and looking at some white anemones and thinking to yourself, wow, those would be great for my wife, I could get her some lilies as well and maybe some verbena, and of course if you did, all you'd get is a slap, or at worse a long sulk, because you just used the language of flowers to insult the woman you married. But if you'd read Golgo 13, you'd know that those flowers were not appropriate. Unless, of course, you were planning on ordering an international hitman to kill you later that day and wanted to send a message of forlorn despair to your family, which of course, I don't recommend, as your family probably won't have read Golgo 13 and so possibly may not get the reference. What they might notice, however, is the fact that Golgo 13 is still a man of action. By which I mean, he simply cannot stand back and watch this long fall of Dawson towards the ground. If he does, he's just an observer. He's just like us. And action heroes are made to suffer, and they're made to strive, which is why he's going to shoot Dawson as he falls. Despite the fact that Dawson's definitely going to die, Golgo shoots him so that he can play some part in the man's end. And incidentally, this sequence is covered in the movie by a voiceover as he falls from Dawson's son. And there's an interesting translation issue here, which is that the name of the addressee comes at the end of the letter. He doesn't say, "Dear father, blah, 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 I hate you, you've ruined my life, I'm going to have Golgo 13 kill me." He says, "Blah, blah, 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 to my dad from your son." which is the way that Japanese letters are supposed to be laid out. And in fact, we can tell from this letter that it's written by a man who has lost all hope, because it breaks one of the cardinal rules of Japanese letter writing, which is that you must always kick off with a seasonal comment, like, I don't know, the leaves are falling from the trees, or blimey, it's snowing, or something like that. And that's considered polite, to have a little chat about the weather before getting down to business. And I mention this because if you're not ready for it and you're dealing, particularly in business, with the Japanese, sometimes the letters can seem to be the work of a complete mentalist. You're trying to work out when you're going to get paid, and actually you get a letter from your boss telling you that the cherry blossoms are in season, and it can be a little jarring. And so here we have the last scene, a final comment on the tragedy of the Dawson family. Laura has been driven mad, or possibly just into penury and prostitution, by her suffering at the hands of Snake and the loss of her daughter. But when she meets Golgo on the street and recognises him as the agent of her demise, she tries to kill him. And I think we're expected to feel sorry for her here, but also we're supposed to feel sorry for Golgo 13, because he was just doing as he was told. He has the "I was only following orders" excuse. He could, of course, become a florist, or a guy who runs a coffee shop, or a model maker, but no, he's a killer. That's what he does. But to my mind, he is very similar to another killer with a supposedly heroic stance, and that's Judge Dredd, who is also a kind of grumpy version of Galahad. He may be a fascist, and he may kill people, and he may have no remorse, but on his own terms, in his own peculiar way, he's pure of heart. So, there you have it. That's Golgo 13, The Professional. The professional element being added to the title in America, by the way, in an attempt to draw people's eyes away from the number 13, because the last thing that the original distributors wanted was people asking where the other 12 Golgo films were. So some versions have The Professional in huge letters and Golgo 13 very small. And in recent years it's switched back to its original incarnation with Golgo 13 writ large. And this is partly because anime fans now know who Golgo 13 is, and partly because of the film Leon, which was also released under the title The Professional in the United States, and which consequently has confused some buyers since. So anyway, that's it from me. Thank you to the people in the booth, and thank you for listening. I've been Jonathan Clements, and you'll probably bump into me on a commentary track sometime soon when your finger next inadvertently slips on the audio selection button. Goodbye.